Okay, good evening, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're logging in from. Welcome to the first show of Career Track for 2024. First one after a long gap. I think the last one I did was in June of last year. We did a series of audio sessions after that, and back to LinkedIn Live now, video. This has always been a great format to engage with all of you, and I'm so excited for the next 60 minutes. Sometime back, I started a practice of publishing a book summary every Monday, and I chanced upon this book called as Jerks at Work, and I published a summary, and the kind of response I got is amazing. People on my WhatsApp status, on LinkedIn, comments on LinkedIn post, DMs, all of them said, "This is the book that was much much needed." And I face a lot of jerks at work, and just like the most wanted and the most watched movie of sorts. This I felt was sure was a most hit book in that sense. And yeah, to some of the requests that came on DM is, like you've done shows with other authors, and those of you who are completely new to Career Trek, this is a series, a video series that I've been doing with CEOs, CHROs, and few authors, select authors. And there was a request saying, why not do a LinkedIn Live with the author of the book? I glad that the post was liked by the author. And then I pinged the author, and she was more than gracious to say, "Wow, let's do it." So here we are. Super excited to have this LinkedIn Live with Tessa West, the author of um, Jux at Work, the book that most of you have been curious, excited, and want to know more. Just a bit of intro about Tessa. Tessa is a professor of psychology at New York, published more than 70 articles in various magazines, journals, published books. And I was so happy to know that the book is published in multiple languages. And she was mentioning a new language, Korean or Japan, which I forgot, 14th language, which is amazing. Goes to show the quality of the book and the viewers it is attracting. And we'll get to know more about her as we proceed. Let me welcome her on stage, and here she is. Hi,
Hi,
hi, Tessa.
hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for accepting to be on the show. Um, a lot of viewers logging in, so let me those of you who have logged in the audience, just introduce yourself, say a hi as we get this conversation going. So yeah, as the introductions start coming in, so introducing yourself in line as I ask the audience. They're bored to death listening to me, knowing me. So why don't we get started with you? I know you are known by the book. One of my favorite introduction approaches is, tell me something that's not on LinkedIn or not in public domain about you. So,
I love that. Um, what is something not out there? I was a competitive tap dancer growing up as a kid. And then I turned into a competitive cheerleader, which all sounds kind of funny, but I think that's prepared me for a life of going on LinkedIn Live events and feeling comfortable talking to people and being on various stages. So I think, I often don't talk about my childhood. Very rarely do people kind of ask what my upbringing was like, but that's kind of one thing that rarely ever kind of comes up. In fact, kind of the weirdest event I've ever done in my life. I was on a stage and all the power went out, and I was giving a talk, and the prompt went off, and the audience started yelling at me, "Entertain me!" It was very strange. So I actually tap danced in 3-inch Jimmy Choo heels on the stage for about 2 minutes until the power came back on, and that was probably one of the weirdest moments of my life, but I was able to kind of bring that childhood experience kind of back into this life I now lead of talking about the book and being at shows like this. So a weird little fun tidbit about myself, but there you go.
Fantastic. How old were you then?
When I did this tap dance on the stage, I was like 35. Yeah. I was too old to be tap dancing on a stage when I was giving a professional talk, but you do what you got to do in those moments, and I tend to sort of embrace weird situations and have a humor about it. So there you go.
Very interesting. And I don't know if it was in the book or one of your talk shows. I hear you analyze people in uncomfortable social settings. You analyze behavior in uncomfortable social settings, and that's how everything emerges. So, uh, tell me about what got you into analyzing these scenarios.
Yeah,
How
it
did,
is a
how did you get
very,
started?
very weird way for a scientist to describe their program of work. I study uncomfortable social interactions, and I think I actually started doing this when I was a first-year university student. I was 18 years old. I had just moved to Santa Barbara, and I decided I wanted to join a lab, and I didn't know anything about social psychology. So the lab I joined actually also did this in the really interesting, creative ways. So the first study I was a part of, we actually looked at what happens when you talk to someone who has a stigma. And so the way we studied that was we looked at people who had big birthmarks on their face, port wine stains on their face, that make people feel a little bit uncomfortable when they're interacting with them. This is in the 1990s, before we were kind of more open about differences in types of appearances that people have. And I was part of this study where makeup artists would come in and they would paint my face. And I didn't know whether they were just putting on regular makeup or they were putting this kind of port wine stain on my face. And then I would go in and I'd interact with people. So I was what we call a confederate in social psychology. I was working with the research team, but the other participant in the study didn't know that. And then we measured people's stress responses, their physiology. And what we found is that when people are uncomfortable, they act really friendly. They're kind of over the top nice. They smile a lot. What we ended up calling brittle smiles, that like, hi, it's so great to meet you kind of face. But underneath the surface, when we look at their below the skin responses, their blood pressure's through the roof, their hearts are pounding. So you get this kind of interesting juxtaposition. So that was my foray into social science, having makeup painted on my face to have a birthmark, interacting with people, watching them be uncomfortable. And ever since then, I've kind of embraced the study of awkward interactions and discomfort. So everything from, asking a boss for a raise or giving negative feedback to someone who holds power over you, to interacting with your doctor, to having a teammate who's rubbing you the wrong way. So all those ways in which people make us uncomfortable, get under our skin, and then affect our physiology, our bodies, and also our behavior. And I've really kind of embraced this, the weirder, the better, but I want it to look like the real world kind of approach to social science. So long-winded answer of how I got into this, but I think that my introduction happened very early, very young, and very strangely. And so I haven't been able to kind of break up with these research paradigms since then that do these kinds of awkward things.
Very interesting. And when I first came across your book, you look like someone from academia, but the topic that you wrote about, is something very, very corporate. Um, and the anecdotes that you share is tells that you sort of got under the skin of corporates. You understand the dynamics at play, etc., etc. So, first, dumb question: have you been a part of corporate ever, or has it been academia all the way through?
That's a good question. It's been academia all the way through, with the exception of selling shoes, which I sold high-end shoe. I worked at a high-end shoe store, but I've never actually been full-time in corporate culture. And so I've kind of had this periphery where, I work in academia, I do a lot of consulting in corporate, and I've even gone into corporate cultures and studied people. I've gone into firms and I've had people interact with each other and negotiate and things like that. But I've never actually had a real grown-up corporate job. I've been in academia since I was 18, and I've had a million side jobs, but So I have this a little bit of like kind of an outsider's view, but really wanting to get in there and get in the skin of kind of what's going on beneath the surface with people. But it's definitely, for you picked up on this theme of, for an academic, it's very unusual to write about corporate culture. For someone who hasn't been firmly embedded in that corporate culture before and just kind of observed it from the outside.
Yeah, and even when you are part of consulting, um, and even when you interact, people only tend to sort of filter and give you the versions, and may not be really open, authentic. Or is it more part of your research that they really open up and probably
Yeah.
share what they may not want to share in a public forum of sorts?
Yes. There's definitely the sort of public facing version, especially when you're talking to people in the C suite or any kind of leadership, the public version, and then the private version. And so I think I try to really break people down, to be honest. And a lot of that comes with just being really open and non judgmental about what people are struggling with. And it's actually pretty interesting. The last event I did with senior leaders, it was like 3 hours long. And the first 20 minutes was a lot of just kind of corporate speak, a lot of like symbolic allyship. But then they really broke down. I think I kind of forced it out of people to just be honest. And I think once that happens, what I find is it doesn't matter what company you're working with or what corporate culture you're in, the people are facing the same issues kind of across the board. And once they break down and start talking to you, you can really start to see those similarities. So, my skill set is in getting people to feel comfortable and honest and tell me like what the real deal is. Like, cut the BS. I just want to hear what the real struggles are. And a lot of that just comes down to developing that trust with people. But there is a bit of a wall there. I think most of the people probably on this call understand you got to like really break through that off and to get people to be honest and to talk about the real stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was as part of preparation for this talk show, I was listening to a podcast you've done with a good friend of mine, Subbu, and
So
yeah, and he had done a sort of rapid fire, and he asked great cultures, and you said are very rare. So do you still hold on to that? As in, I'm sure you've studied a lot of nationalities, geographies, cultures, etc. What percentage of organizations have good cultures?
not many. I'm a very cynical person. I mean, the more we talk about it, the more that we uncover that it isn't great. So I think sort of the bright side of me saying that is I actually think it's important for us to admit when things suck and the culture is bad. And pinpointing what the issues are. If you would have maybe asked me this 3 years ago, I probably would have been like, oh, maybe half, 50%. But now that I start to really talk to people, I realize that number is actually pretty low. I think the main reason why I say that is because a lot of my conversations involve kind of private confessions. No one shows up anymore. No one comes back to the office. They're disengaged. A lot of people cry, but the public facing is, I love working here. It's a lot of kind of positivity on LinkedIn and creating that like culture of support. So I just think there's this huge discrepancy between what people are really feeling and experiencing and then what the sort of public version of what they say and what other people in the workplace say is. And a lot of that is around like reputation management. You don't want to look like a complainer, especially on platforms like LinkedIn. You want to look like, supportive, and then you don't gossip about people at work. But the reality is lots of people are unhappy. And I think we're all in kind of a stage of existential angst around our jobs right now and what we want and what can make it better. So, I tend to just be very cynical about this, but kind of hopefully leading with the first step is actually kind of breaking through and admitting that there's that problem. But I would love to hear that people have wonderful work cultures and what's taken to get there. But I have seen very few kind of places that are actually thriving at all levels, including kind of the lowest level, people who don't have power and status.
Yeah, very, very interesting observation. I was talking to a friend of mine who is supposedly part of a company certified as best places. There are many organizations who certify you as best place. There are 3 to 4 organizations. I don't want to take names. The organization has come in top 10, top 20 of sorts. But still, the experience that the person goes through is very different. So, like you said, there is a posturing, and there is reputation management, and there is reality. Um, I was curious. I was trying to put up this question for people to say, share your experience of dealing with a jerk. And as I put up this question, I understand I'm expecting people to type on LinkedIn, an open platform, and they may not want to share. So,
Well,
so
about the person who's in this call with you that you hate. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that.
yeah, I may get more DMs, but I may not get comments right here. So
That has been my experience as well. People will rarely publicly disclose, but they will privately tell you. So I understand if people feel uncomfortable talking about that. I think, one of the things I've learned with dealing with jerks is that most people, the hardest thing is knowing whether they're alone. Are they the only victim? What are they doing to feed into the situation? There's a lot of ambiguity around sort of the cause. My boss tortures me, but I can't tell if they torture other people because we work remotely and I don't see how they interact with others. So, I mean, if you're wondering whether you are alone in this, chances are no. There's a sea of other lonely people who are also on the receiving end of that jerk behavior. But, to the extent that you aren't connected or you don't feel comfortable talking about it, there's just not a platform for it. It can be a very isolating and lonely experience to feel victimized, I think, by difficult people at work, for sure.
yeah. So when I've been during all my coaching experiences, my coaches, one common thread that I see is definitely and one of the problems that people definitely face is having met a jerk at workplace. Many times it happens to be their manager, and sometimes a colleague, but a lot of cases. So one of my LinkedIn posts, I talk about going through being part of a hostile workplace, work environment. This is something that you will definitely go through once, at least in your career. You're lucky, you're great. If you haven't come across, very happy for you. But you can safely assume that you would interact with, you would hit that patch of dealing with a hostile work environment at some point or the other in the career. So this I can safely assume. And like, good to hear from you, Ashima. She was, and the last part of the sentence is the key for me. Most real and the least talked about topic. And I think that explains why your book is a great success. So what's been how did you arrive at writing a book?
How did I go? Sorry, I missed that. You broke up a tiny bit in there. Say that one more time.
How did you arrive at the idea of writing a book? I know you publish
Oh,
articles, journals, etc., but how a book came into being?
that's a really good question. It's a very different thing for me to do. I usually write empirical articles. I'm a statistician. I do a lot of methodology. And so writing a book like this was very different. I never thought I could write a book. I was never even interested in writing a book. And then my book agent actually approached me out of the blue and was like, I think you should write a book. I'm like, who are you and how do you know who I am? So that was a weird experience because usually it kind of goes the other way around. And so he kind of talked me into writing a book. It really came from my own struggles. This book was kind
Mhm.
of the product of me getting off my chest all the times I had been a jerk and couldn't see it coming, didn't see it coming. And I felt like, how did I miss all those clues in my environment that I was pissing people off, or how defensive was I that I sort of missed that evidence that, once I held this position of power, I was rubbing people the wrong way. I was bulldozing, those kinds of things. So it came out of my own kind of immense frustration in dealing with a position of power for the first time and completely mishandling that position of power and, creating enemies that were friends for decades before that and that kind of thing. Plus just coupled with, my own experience of being on the receiving end of this and feeling really sort of helpless and clueless. And then going into corporate culture and having people come up to me and say to me, start the sentence with, "This is really embarrassing, but," followed by some kind of mundane problem they were dealing with that they never received training in. And so kind of one of the surprising things I learned is that no matter how high up you climb at work, you could be, you know, the CEO, you could be the company president, you probably don't have great skills at handling small conflicts at work, at handling, you know, little fights between the people who report to you, disruptive kinds of cultural issues. We don't get trained on that stuff. And so people felt ashamed that they had to ask me for help. And that to me is like a big red flag that we're just not learning these things, that interpersonal conflict skills are not taught, at least not in the workplace. And we're sort of taught to either ignore it or pretend like it's not happening, or to like just focus on the work. And I think that happens a lot. And so I decided to write a book that was a little storytelling, you know, kind of storytelling and science, to make myself feel better about my own jerkery at work. And then also just to be super practical and try to defang the problem. I think it's really intimidating to deal with jerks, and people feel like they don't know where to start. And so I try to be as concrete as possible, but it was really fun writing this book, except for the fact that it was during the pandemic and I had a 6-year-old running around the house at the same time. But aside from that, you know, it was a huge departure from my typical statistics papers that I write, research papers. But yeah, and I want people to feel okay if they're the jerk too. And I think that was kind of a huge goal in writing this book.
Yeah, on a submission, any journal or white paper or research that comes out of some university, I just pass it off, because the very nature of writing, etc., somehow doesn't really attract me so much. It seems slightly theoretical and academic in nature. But I know I'm talking to a professor in you. But I'm so glad the narrative is so different in the way you wrote. You know, anecdotal and so relatable. So
Yeah, I try to just use real talk. I think that no one likes it when people, you know, when academics stand up on their high horse and they preach to you about how you should behave at work without admitting their own mistakes. And I think I'm not a typical professor. I think I don't talk like a typical professor. I don't come from an academic background. You know, my dad was a construction worker. My mom was a teacher. I've been working since I was 14. So I feel like, you know, I've had a million jobs, every weird job you can imagine, from making pretzels to working in a video store to being robbed in a video store. I've done it all. And so I feel like, you know, and I'm comfortable sort of talking to people and using kind of real speak and not using academic jargon, which I feel like not even academics like that stuff. But I feel like if you're going to write a book like this, it needs to be just kind of concrete, straightforward, and hopefully funny. You know, that was my primary goal, was to keep it a little bit funny, because this is an intense topic and it can stress people out. So you need to be a little bit lighthearted with your approach.
yeah, with my interactions so far, I can definitely tell you that if you hadn't told me that you're a professor, I wouldn't recognize you as one. So
I take that as a compliment.
well, I meant it as
Whatever
one.
your stereotype is. You get that a lot. I show up to talks and people are like, "You're not in HR." Apparently, I look like I work in human resources, which I'm like, "No, I'm not." But thank you. Yes.
Oh, that's a very interesting profile, from tap dance to, you know, selling shoes to professor and an author. That's a diverse profile.
Yeah, I don't really fit in a box. I feel like I've tried to fit in various boxes. I've tried to be like in the dancer box or the sales box or the professor box, but I never fit in a box. So I'm tired of trying to fit. I think probably people can relate to that experience of, I don't fit in here. I don't look or act like, you know, everybody else. I think, you know, one thing I don't talk about in the book that's kind of come up a lot is when people feel like they're first generation, or they don't come from money, or they come from a lower social class and everybody at work, how do you fit in, and how can you tell if you're being discriminated against, or you're not invited to that leadership opportunity or that Saturday activity with everyone else because you're different. And kind of one area of research I'm going into now is social class interactions. And that's a huge thing at work that we don't talk a lot about. I mean, at least in the States, we've talked about gender a ton. We've talked about race a ton. But class differences are really what's dominating a lot of the kind of intergroup conflict in the workplace right now. People feeling like they have to pass. They come from a class that isn't what everyone around them is from, or they have a last name that signals that they don't come from that group, or an ethnicity or religion or whatever it is. And, the jerk behavior that they're facing, the boss that's stealing credit, the kiss up, kick downer who is an a-hole to them when the boss isn't around. There's this extra layer of, is it because I'm different? Is it because I come from a different social class? And, I wanted to talk about that stuff in the book. It got shot down for various sort of PR reasons. It's very difficult to kind of fold that into a general book about interpersonal workplace behavior. But I do think that is an issue that is a little bit more near and dear to my heart, and that a lot of people that come talk to me say, how do you handle it when you think your class might be an issue, when there's class divide, or when you don't come from where these people come from, you don't sound like them, you don't have the hidden curriculum like them. How do you then kind of navigate the workplace? So that's kind of something I've been exploring a lot lately.
Interesting. Just looking at a couple of comments. Hi, Panchaksharaya. Hi, Lata. Yeah, I think looking at the comments as a representation of the audience, I think everyone definitely has met a jerk at work, and that's safe to assume as well. That brings me to this quandary. A lot of people whom I interact with, coach and socialize otherwise, have this notion of this dirty corporate politics.
Yeah.
And they form this the cultures are a mix of, they're not black and white, they're gray. You'll see different shades of these people, but because sometimes you don't want to deal with it, be part of it, it takes too much of energy to navigate and strategize and operate in a certain way. People sort of tend to shut themselves and say, I'll just go about doing my work. I want to stay away from all this politics, and because of it, if I'm not growing, so be it.
Yeah.
So how do you, have you come across people sort of withdraw into this? Have you come across those situations?
Oh yeah, I think that is kind of the dominant response is everyone, there are rules here that I don't want to be a part of. There are rules of what it takes to get ahead, of who you should step on, and whose ideas you should steal, and how dominant you should be, and how you should present yourself. And I don't want to be part of that culture, so I'm just going to do my work. Sorry, everyone. Those things are not mutually exclusive. They are all part of one big sort of web of destruction in the workplace. And I think, just to give you a super concrete example of that, sometimes, if you don't play those games, you can't get promoted because you're not kind of showcasing the behavior that they pluck out for leadership positions, dominance behaviors, aggression, stepping on the right toes at the right time, those kinds of things. Or you maybe have a boss who isn't playing by those rules either, and they don't have a voice in the room when it comes to making promotion decisions. So I think the first thing you need to do is just dispel the notion that you can get your work done in a culture like that and thrive. If you aren't playing by those kind of status jockeying, hierarchy enhancing rules, doesn't matter how good you are at your job, you're not going to have a voice in the room. Your boss probably isn't going to have a voice in the room, and so forth. And so the unfortunate reality is these things, they all come together they're all intertwined with each other. You can't kind of pull them apart. And the first question you want to ask yourself is this whole place like this? And is it reinforced from the top down? Or am I just in, maybe a silo of the organization or a small bubble of the organization where it's particularly toxic? But the minute I leave that, the grass is much greener. And I think it's a difficult question to ask. How widespread is this culturally, and how endorsed is it from the top down? But that's where social networking is really critical, and talking to people who are immediately outside of your function or your team to see how widespread the problem is. And the advice I tell people is, if it seems to be, diffuse and kind of everywhere, and if it's coming from the top down, it's encouraged, you're not going to be able to fight that. And even if you're an individual contributor, you're not going to be able to fight that culture. That's where you want to start going elsewhere, looking elsewhere. But you actually probably don't know the answer to that question. You might think it's super widespread, and it's actually not. It's just within your team of 5. And don't rely on the people in your team of 5 to tell you how widespread it is. You got to network outside to actually figure out the answer to that question. But I don't think this putting your head down, disengaging from the kind of status enhancing behaviors that we need to do at work, that's not usually the answer. Finding out how widespread it is and whether it's coming from the top down or the first steps that you need to take, because you won't be able to actually succeed in a place like this if there's a so-called cultural mismatch between what you want to do to get ahead and what everyone else is doing to get ahead, and frankly, what it takes to get ahead. So I think that's an honest conversation you have to have with yourself.
Yeah, I think I think this is a question that we sort of answered in a way that Panchakshariya is asking. What's your opinion on working on safe zone working? So I'm reading it as pretty much I'll go about doing my job and let the dynamics play out and leave it to destiny of sorts. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that that approach may not sort of be the best one. Reading the room, reading the organization, having that acumen to sense what's the right thing to do in the environment. How do you navigate that? I think that's a critical skill in itself.
Yeah, I think sort of one thing we don't think a lot about, I mean, I study status, and so that's having, respect and prestige from the people around you. You absolutely have to have status, and you need to gain status to get ahead at work. And status does a lot of things for us. We don't like to think of status hierarchies as good, but they're actually essential to getting work done. They allow people to have roles. It makes it clear who has expertise, who we should listen to, who we should ignore. So all of that's really important. And you need to have status at work to be able to actually have your voice heard, to have whatever your contributions are, make it to the top of the pile, and to be one of those people who's named in one of those rooms where they're trying to figure out who to promote. So once you sort of admit to yourself, okay, I need to have status here, it's going to be very hard to get ahead without it. Then you have to ask the question, what does it look like to have status here? Who has it? Is it earned? Is it based on experience, expertise? Or is it what we call unearned status in social psychology? Is it based on who your dad is? Are you a nepotism hire? What is your last name? And what is your social class? Or is it based on real things tied to the actual performance of the team, to doing well at work? And you're going to absolutely need that status, but what you need to figure out is who has it and what it takes to get it. And if those things that it takes to get it are not tethered to the actual skills needed at work, it's more related to who you're related to, or whether you're friends with the boss and things like that, then you're in a place where it's going to be very tough to climb up. But I think kind of this safe zone at work assumes that we don't need to know how to read the room, that we don't need to know how to gain status and have influence and have our voice heard. And those things are just simply not true. And so, I love this idea of being able to feel comfortable and safe at work. But if it pulls you out of the ability to gain status, or it tries to take you out of the equation of reading other people's status, then I just don't think it's effective. We need to actually be intermingling with one another and figure out what it takes to climb up. And then if you don't like what it takes to climb up here, then that's kind of a different answer that can put you in a different direction.
I like the term that you used, in the book and in one of your talk shows, saying social capital.
Yep.
So call it influence, power, status, amalgamation of all those things. That's the currency with which you sort of operate, and that's a currency that gives you voice. That gives you voice in the room, in the organization, and it amplifies your skill and gets you what you want. So, how important do you see the core skill vis-a-vis the social capital?
Yeah. So I have some work on who is good at actually gaining social capital and who is good at reading the amount of social capital that other people have. And I think, this is what we call an individual difference. So some people are kind of better at figuring out who has social capital and who doesn't. And then they can kind of read the clues of what it looks like to have social capital. So kind of one example of that is, here's a real simple example. Say you're in a meeting with 5 people and you speak up and say an idea. Does that idea get built upon by other people, and are they echoing your contributions? Are they saying, I like what Tessa said a minute ago about X, I'm going to now elaborate on it? Or does the idea die the minute you stop talking, and then the group automatically just kind of switches gears and talks about something else? If that happens to you over and over again, you probably don't have social capital. So that's just the ability to like change the direction of a conversation. Another example is if you write an email to someone in power, how quickly do they reply? Do they never reply? Versus another person, do they get that response right away? Little clues like that can tell you who has power and who has social capital. And I think this skill is really, really important. Some of us are better at it than others. There are some techniques you can do to kind of learn how to have these things. I'm happy to kind of weigh in on that. But I think it's absolutely essential to have it. I think it does. Social capital and status get a bit of a bad reputation because it sounds like you're power hungry. You're trying to like just climb to the top. That's not really what I mean by social capital and social status. I mean that you have influence where you ought to have influence. If you're an expert at something, if you're good at something, people should be listening to you. They shouldn't listen to everything you should say, but they should listen to the things you say that are tethered to what you actually have expertise in. And all I mean by social capital and status is that your influence at work is directly tied to the expertise that you bring to the room and to your skill set. And, that is really what you should be looking for. And you should be looking for it in yourself. But when you're interviewing for a job or you're thinking about being promoted, you want to look around the room and see if that's also happening. This person's good at this thing. Are people listening to them? If they're bad at this thing, are they not listening to them? Both pieces are important. So to that end, I say kind of redefining social capital and status and all of that, and just making sure that that influence is tethered to the skill that you're bringing, that it's sort of earned, or it's actually based on actual expertise and experience.
Yeah. So it's not storytelling without substance. It's built on expertise, and influence sort of amplifies and gets you that voice.
It should. Now, I'm going to be cynical again and tell you that a lot of workplaces, people have status, but it's not earned status. It's based on other things. So the bulldozer who I talk about in my book, that person often has influence in the room. They're able to kind of control the outcomes of group decisions, not because they should or they have expertise in that area, but because they're doing kind of sneaky behaviors behind the scenes. They're climbing up, or they're meeting with their old friend, some senior leader that they've been playing golf with for the last 10 years. They're, whispering little things in their ear to get them to question what the team is doing. So that is someone who has immense power in the room, who has status in the room, but it's not earned because it's not actually based on the expertise or, what they're bringing to the argument. That they're doing some shady sort of behind the scenes behaviors. And a lot of people who have power at work, that's true. You're wondering, why is this person able to influence decisions? They're not saying anything interesting, and they're not even very good. Well, that's how, they have status with people that you don't realize. And a lot of this is going on sort of behind the scenes. You're not noticing this. You're not in the rooms where they're exerting power, but you can feel the sort of tailwind of those conversations when they show up to your meetings. And so that requires a lot of digging. So, I sound like Game of Thrones or make the workplace sound like the Game of Thrones, but I do think that you should be a little cynical when you look around the room and say, who's able to kind of gain status here? Is it earned? Why do they have all this power when they don't seem to be particularly effective at work? I'm going to do some digging and figure out why, and whether I want to work in a workplace that gives power to people like that, who exert power through these ways that are not tethered to their actual expertise.
Very interesting. And that brings me to a dimension when we talk about extroversion, introversion as a nature. And it's a perception that introverts tend to be more the safe zone working types, and whereas extroversion, people who are high on extroversion tends to operate more around social capital, etc., etc. What's your view on that? And does that, from an organization culture point of view, shouldn't we be idealistic? Shouldn't we be offering a level playing field, irrespective of these things.
Yeah, I love this idea of kind of bringing in introversion and extroversion into the conversation. I think one of the biggest misconceptions in social science is that extroverts are actually better at gaining power and status because they're more comfortable speaking up. There's actually very little relationship between extroversion and, we found in our study, actually, we measured this. Extroversion, introversion is not really that highly related with the ability to read the room and to figure out who has status. What it's related to is comfort in social situations with new people that you don't know very well. And kind of more importantly, what it's related to is your battery doesn't get completely depleted when you're in those interactions. Introverts, believe it or not, I'm an introvert. And I'm actually like perfectly capable at chatting away if I need to, but it's a little bit draining for me. So that's where the difference lies. Introverts can be some of the best people at gaining status and reading the room because they self-edit what they say. And so when they speak up, they tend to use their words wisely. They're very well timed and kind of knowing when to speak up, who to interrupt and who to not interrupt. And, the ones that bring a lot of skills to the table, their ideas actually do that thing I was talking about earlier, where when they say something, it's important and it moves the conversation in a new direction. And people tend to kind of stick to those ideas and then build on them. And so introversion can actually be a major asset in the workplace because to the extent that you're not kind of talking nonstop or looking to make friends, you're reading the room, you're paying attention to the dynamics between people, and you don't speak up a lot. But when you do, it's, during those important moments, and people tend to kind of weigh your contributions more heavily than extroverts because you say fewer words. You can actually be really good at all these skills that I'm talking about. And I think people are often afraid of speaking up if they're introverts. So you kind of need to plan it ahead of time and even maybe talk to another person who's going to be in the meeting to figure out when you can do it. But definitely there's no real relationship between extroversion and introversion and what we call status acuity, or the ability to read the room and climb up. Introverts tend to be actually more popular at work than they realize because they're not always running their mouths and because they don't have this impression that they're out there to kind of impress people, and they're not always kind of talking in impression management mode.
Yeah, I sort of have a bias, and I consider an introvert myself. I sort of have a bias that introverts are typically more observant, and they can read the room slightly better because they're not so much about showcasing themselves or talking about themselves, but are observing everyone and trying to read the room and then making the point at the right time of sorts.
Yeah, they're also really good at I think what I talk about in the book, the stoplight rule. So they know when to stop rambling. Most of us get about 10 seconds to make our point in a meeting. Once you're kind of over that mark, especially around the 30-second mark, people start to really space out. And so if you're just kind of free associating and you're talking too much, you actually lose social capital. So I have a lot of research showing that talk time, the amount of time you spend running your mouth, is not at all related to power and status and influence. All it's related to is kind of getting under people's skin. And so, talking less, but it's more what you say than kind of how much you say.
Great. So here is a question from Christian. He's saying, do you think training interventions on DEI would work in a conservative organization? Will that help reduce jerk behavior?
Yeah, I like this question. Yeah. So I've done a lot of research on diversity, and I've done a lot of DE&I sessions. The research is pretty clear on this, that these sessions don't work on anybody. There's a New York Times article that came out a couple years ago.
That's such a disappointment to so many people.
Well, because it's how they're done. So, we've gone through a couple awkward phases of DE&I training sessions, and these were all the rage during the pandemic. And, and I'm one of those people that was part of a lot of these. A lot of the bias that we have at work is subtle. It's expressed during moments of ambiguity. So you're trying to decide between two job candidates who are equally qualified, but in different ways. You're going to go with the one you're more comfortable with, who looks like a culture fit, who maybe comes from a background similar to other people's, but you can easily rationalize that decision by saying, well, I actually like this skill that they have more than this other person's skill. And we don't really see prejudice emerging until you look at about 60 hiring decisions and you see this pattern. You're always going for, the person who came from this higher social class or the person who came from Harvard or whatever, but you can justify any one decision. And so you can't really kind of outthink that level of, subtle forms of bias. I also study behavior, and most bias actually comes through nonverbal, on what we call automatic behaviors. So the stuff you can control, like what you say, we tend to not be prejudiced, but how you say it, how fidgety you are, how uncomfortable you are, how much you avoid eye contact, that's where the bias gets expressed. So I'd say, long story short, most DE&I trainings don't work at all on anybody, but what does work is just creating a culture of inclusion that's really widespread. So conservative people, I've worked with a lot of conservative organizations, they often also feel, especially politically conservative people in certain professions, feel like they're the minority being discriminated against. So if you can actually frame this around inclusion and inclusive behaviors that everybody can practice, things like calling on the remote person first in a meeting instead of calling on them last because they're farthest away, they feel sort of least socially connected, things like that. Or, I wrote a Wall Street Journal article called 7 Steps to Reduce Bias in Hiring. Those things can be applied to everybody. And, the key here is to not make it about certain groups. This isn't about you're the mean group and you're the victims and you're the perpetrators. You're the ones that do all the discriminating and you're the ones that are on the receiving end of discriminating and separating people in these groups. You got to abolish all of that speak and just make it about how can we all make each other feel more included. We all know what it feels like to be excluded, to be the last kid picked on the team. Let's just teach everyone those inclusive behaviors. And everyone can do them and everyone can be on the receiving end of them. And I think that's kind of the best policy. When I do these trainings and I walk into a conservative organization, the first thing they do is breathe a sigh of relief when I tell them, this is not going to be the DE&I training that you fear. This is going to be me telling you you're all baddies and you need to go to hell and replace yourselves with other people. I abolish that. I do it with humor, and they immediately breathe a sigh of relief. And then they start telling me what their own issues are and their own concerns and how they're often even worried about being allies because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so we get a lot of what we call freezing behavior, where they do nothing at all, or they allow companies love having these kinds of special interest groups, but they don't actually really do anything. And so I try to get rid of all that stuff. I think there's a lot of nonsense out there. There's a lot of symbolic stuff. So it's all about inclusion. So short answer is DEI trainings largely suck, but if you retrain around inclusion behaviors that anyone can do, doesn't matter if the organization is liberal or conservative, because you're actually going to leave all of that at the door and not make it about certain groups.
Yeah, so here is a slightly longish comment and a question from Lata. I think I'll just read it out. She's saying that's a great insight about those who gain power by influencing old friends in position of power. There's also that loudest in the room, having more power, even if they may not have so much substance. I've seen this a lot in my career, and sometimes you have to learn to interject and speak in your area of expertise and bring the meeting back on track. Any thoughts on how can this be done effectively? So just building on that question from Lata, just moving into types of jerks, especially when it comes to gaslighting. I've seen few people who were labeled as underperformers and deadwood in the organization suddenly thrive when they move to a different team in the same organization. And that's there could be multiple factors, and one of them is how they feel about themselves in that setting, etc., etc. So if someone is experiencing that gaslighting, self-doubt kind of behavior, what do you suggest for that person to do?
Yeah, love this question. So first off, power isn't something that a person has. Power is situational. So if anyone's ever been in a situation where they're the boss at work, but they are not the boss at home, you know what this feels like. Power is a social construct. We have power in contextual moments, right? So you're not a powerful person or a not powerful person. A situation gives you power. People in that situation can give it to you or take it away from you. And I think that the example you gave just kind of illustrates that. So if you feel like you're one of these people who's potentially underperforming in one situation, but you don't know if it's the situation or if it's you, the first thing you have to do is actually network with people who are a little bit outside of your bubble. And I tend to tell people, often when, especially if it's a boss who's making us feel like this, we either want to complain directly to the boss, or go to HR, just kind of shoot straight up to make our complaint. But instead, actually, what I think what you should do is kind of go up and over a little bit. So find someone who is a colleague of your boss, or someone who works in another team but has worked with some of the same people as you. So there's a little bit of overlap, but not a ton of overlap. And what your goal is to get a reality check, is to understand what the realities around the behavior that person solicits out of others. So if you kind of take this idea to heart that power is socially determined, how often does your boss or coworker who's making you feel like an underperformer, how often do they do that to other people as well? How often are they sucking the power out of the room when they're in other social contexts? And I think often what happens with gaslighting is you get isolated by your gaslighter. And so by intent, they're cutting you off from that chain of communication, that shared reality check. You need to actually go to other people who've worked with that person and not gossip about them, but ask what what are the strengths and weaknesses of that relationship in the past? What were the situations where people really thrived in working with that person? Ask, kind of frame them positively, and do this with multiple people. So you kind of what we call like a truth by consensus effect, a wisdom of the crowds. How often are other people having these experiences? And then you can start to kind of build a story of how much of your low power is really about that person sucking power from everybody, versus there's a unique dynamic with you. And I think the social isolation and getting over that is really key. You need to actually break whatever sort of pattern that boss or the leader is creating of cutting you off. They're going to do it by intent. They're going to tell you not to talk to other people. They're going to threaten you if you do. So find those kind of parallel social network people that are connected with your team members and have worked with your boss, but don't necessarily have a stake in the game. And find out from them what that relationship looked like, and ask them the question: how have people really performed well working with this individual in the past? And if they can't come up with anything, that's also telling. I tend to like to get my gossip through positive framing. So if it gets back to that person, it won't harm you. All you did was ask, how can I thrive here? That's not a negative thing. So a lot goes into kind of how you frame these questions. But social networking and finding those kind of nodes in your social network that are connected to that person is absolutely essential to figure out how much of this power relationship is really about, the special dynamic between the two of you, or their just ability to suck power out of the room in any room that they walk into.
Great. And I think as someone grows into more leadership roles, these social capital is something that the skills on building social capital is something that becomes more important as someone grows into leadership roles, and that becomes very critical over there in terms of reading the room, navigating, and so on and so forth. So someone who is moving into a senior leadership role of sorts, is there something that you recommend that they do in terms of upping their game on these skills?
Yeah, this is great. The only way to really learn is by observing and watching. So if you're a person who's about ready to get promoted into some position of leadership, but all you've done is work with, say, your 10 direct reports and your one boss, you're going to need exposure to what the meetings look like between your boss and the other bosses. So for example, right now I'm a professor, but I'm in a couple committees that are full of powerful people in a room making decisions. And because I don't have a ton of power yet, I tend to be a fly on the wall. But being in those meetings, which are, once a month for 1 hour, shows me how people talk to one another who have power, what it looks like to exert influence in those rooms. And it's often very different than what my intuition was. My intuition is, well, whoever talks the most is going to have influence, because in academia, that terrible sort of bulldozing strategy works. But among high status people, it's very different. And I look at where people sit, and I look at things like who gets up and has coffee when someone's speaking, and who are they interrupting to get coffee from, and how do they talk to one another. And so if you're going to be in a position of power, part of your training needs to be, I need to be in the room, for people who are going to hold power over me. I need to be in those decision-making rooms before I get promoted as kind of an onboarding process. So ask to be invited to some of those decisions, even if it's just to be a fly on the wall, even if it's a low-level decision-making meeting that doesn't really matter too much. Exposure is key, and you don't want to wait until you hold power to then go into those rooms. So I tend to try to get on those kinds of, sausage making committees where real decisions are made early on, so I can kind of learn what those dynamics are at play, which are very different than the level down from them, incredibly different in ways that I was like shocked at. So, but I wouldn't learn any of those things if someone just explained them to me. I need to actually be sitting there watching them.
Yeah, that's a great insight actually. And when I reflect on how I picked up some of those skills, it's making me think of some meetings, high level meetings, where I was a fly on the wall, but I got to see the dynamics playing out between people with power. And some of the aspects that you think of matter actually don't matter.
Yeah.
And
And some people you think have power because they flex all the time outside of those rooms. They go in the room and they're like, like a tiny little ball of anxiety. This happened to me, this person who's super flexy in real life. Such a big deal. I go into this room and there's no more seats left. They're like, go find a chair, and like within 5 minutes, I'm like, ooh. Capital as I thought she did, because the way she talks about herself is very much misaligned with how she's treated. So you also learn to reshuffle that hierarchy a little bit in your mind. Kind of like figure out who has a real power and who doesn't, who's just kind of BSing you about how much power they have.
yeah, and we are pretty much close to our time, but I want to catch up on this topic, and I wrote about it in my today's post. Talking about our show, a realization that I always thought I'm a great ally, and some of the instances that you narrate and the quiz that you have, and a shout out to all the viewers. You can look up Tessa's website. It has quizzes, and can definitely shock you and give you a self realization whether you are an ally or you are a jerk. I took up that thinking, I am an ally for sure, and there can't be no two ways about it. And then I realized there are situations where I have been a jerk. Um, and there are times where I have sort of allowed jerks to nurture, um, by act of omission.
Yeah.
I may not, by being silent to things that are not going right around me. I sort of encourage people with these bully behaviors to carry on.
Yeah.
So that's a great self-awareness. Thanks for creating such a uh, fantastic tool, and I like the aspect where you said, being an ally, it's not about it's not a feel goody thing.
Yeah.
um,
It's uncomfortable.
it costs.
It's pretty uncomfortable, actually.
Uncomfortable, and you're putting something on the line to be an ally. And there are situations where not being an ally and being a jerk works, and people succeed, and you see them climbing the ladder.
Yeah.
And being an ally looks like this righteous thing to do, but with no rewards of sorts. Um,
Yeah.
how do you
There's
deal with that dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, it was very popular over the last 3 years to be a symbolic ally, which people thought gained them social capital. So they'd say the right things publicly, but real allies do the behind the scenes work. And
Mhm.
they're willing to put themselves out there and lose social capital. And so I actually talked to Subu about this, that allyship, when you see it playing out in real life, it's a really uncomfortable thing to watch, because usually it means somebody calling out somebody else for discrimination, for mishandling a situation. So it's conflict, it's potentially losing social capital. Most people who really need an ally tend to be lower in power and status. And so by its very nature, we spend a lot of time talking about status. If you're going to help someone who's lower in power and lower in status, you're not going to gain status that way. That's not how anyone on this planet gain status, right? You might gain respect from certain people, but helping people who are lower in status than you and giving them resources in your time, that is not, unfortunately, a skill that we value a ton, and it's often done invisibly behind the scenes. So I think, part of the reason why we don't see a lot of like real allies, true allies, is because it's not rewarded in the workplace. It's actually often kind of punished in the workplace. But I really try to encourage people to do this. I mean, once I've gained power, I try to like really shift gears and be much more of a vocal ally for people in interpersonal interactions. So not just symbolically tweeting that I care about disadvantaged people, but actually walking to the office of someone with power and saying, what you just did was really wrong, and I don't like that, and doing those kinds of things. More power you have, the more social capital you have, you should be using it for that resource, for that good. And I think it's easy to say that. I'm not going to sit here and say it's comfortable. I've lost a lot of social capital doing this. And there are times when I've just wimped out and not done it and just sat there and then felt really gross after. So I think that what you talked about is actually the most common experience. Is you're not outwardly a jerk, but you're not helping people who are victimized either. You're just like, it's not my problem. I don't need to be part of the solution. So try to be as self-critical as you can, but also give yourself a little bit of a break if you're finding it uncomfortable, and just realize that is what an ally is. It's an uncomfortable, potentially power-losing thing that you're doing, and you're making that decision on your own, and you're deciding that it's worth it.
Yeah, but you feel good about yourself being an ally.
Yeah.
I think
And I've gained power in other indirect ways, because people will find out, oh, this person's actually really good at standing up for lower status people. It might not happen right away that kind of reputation gets attached to you, but over time it does. And people start to care a lot more about those soft skills more now than they ever did before. So don't give up if you feel like it's just a losing game.
Great. So here is a question from Prithvish. So I've seen individuals ask reflective questions to the jerk in the room to balance the power. What's your take on it? So I think what he's asking is, one of the ways of managing these people who are whom I think I've heard you talk about saying occupy the entire space. So is that one of the strategies, or are there any other strategies?
Yeah, I think so. If you have someone who's sucking the oxygen out of the room, the best thing you can do is and most people know who this person is going into the meeting, is to strategize ahead of time and to have other high power, high status people take on the work of doing the interrupting and building the conversation in different directions. This does not work if it's just done kind of, in the moment. It's not planned ahead of time. You end up with a lot of kind of arguing and status jockeying. But if you go into the room ahead of time, I actually think it's a really good idea. I would not recommend this for lower status people. Do not try to jockey for power or to cut off your high status bulldozer. High power people on this call, this is your job to find the other people with a little bit of status and say, okay, what are we going to do when Tom interrupts us for the 100th time? Let's plan. Okay, first, Tessa's going to speak up and say, it'd be great if we could hear from some of the other voices in the room, such as, and then call on the lower status people. Then when they speak up, have other people echo their contributions. I really love what Stacy just said, or whatever. So you have to kind of build those techniques in, but they need to be planned ahead of time. But I actually really like this idea. I think you can also turn lemons into lemonade a little bit if you have a person like this and approach them and say, you feel comfortable speaking up. Would you feel comfortable actually speaking up on behalf of so-and-so, or calling on so-and-so in the room? And so you can actually kind of take that crappy trait they have of cutting people off and re-engaging it. Doesn't always work, but sometimes does. And sometimes they're sort of like grateful to be included. So I think both approaches work.
Yeah. Great. So thanks, Prithvish, for bringing up this point and adding value to the conversation. So what I hear you say is people who are lower in status by design, difficult for them to really deal with the jerks, especially if they are higher in status, etc. Because you don't have so much social capital to put and to deal with the scenarios of sorts. But it will be great if there are people with higher social capital, higher status, if they become allies and sort of make the situation more palatable for everyone to work together of sorts. Is that?
Yeah. I think you always want a high status ally to help you out. But the other thing that can happen is if you don't have one of those people, or you don't feel like you can get those people to help you, there can be a lot of power in numbers. And so if you have a bunch of other people who are the same level as you, who maybe don't have a ton of status, and you all get together with a shared narrative or a plan, that can also work as well. And I think that's really important for dealing with, say, the kiss up, kick downer, where you want to complain to your boss, but your boss loves this person. Well, you're not going to get a ton of senior leaders complaining about this person either, but you might get, 5 other junior people who are threatening to disengage or to leave if this problem isn't solved. And no one wants to bleed a lot of talent at once. It looks really bad for bosses to lose a lot of people at one time. And so that can also work as well. If you don't feel like you can get high power people to help you out, get a bunch of other lower power, lower status people, and then coming kind of as a team with a shared narrative around the behaviors you've observed and what you would like to see change. But the key is to focus on behaviors and not so much your feelings or how you feel, disrespected, but what exactly has this person done? So I think that's kind of another important lesson here.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot for a bunch of low status people to come together. The situation has to reach a certain threshold that people really come together and make a voice. But otherwise, I've seen quite a bit of leaders who are jerks get away. That's probably the reality of sorts, because you don't have those structures, and cultures need to evolve over time of sorts. Just curious in terms of, because you have studied various geographies now, your book is traveling across different countries as well. Do you see a pattern in terms of where this is more intense, less intense, types of organizations? Are there any insights that you got around this?
Yeah. So Korea and India are the top countries that are dealing with status issues. And so these are countries that tend to have much stricter status hierarchies, where it's kind of clear what people's rank ordering is within the organization and how you ought to behave if you have status and power. So those are, I've done a lot of interviews in Indian media around this issue of status and power and around social class. And the same is true in Korea. See a little bit in Japan as well. I think in terms of organizations, it's interesting. I thought at first I got a lot of complaints from law firms, which are zero sum. So whoever, only a certain number of people can make partner. So it's zero sum climbing to the top. But lately I've seen it in every type of organization, including a lot of nonprofits. So just because the organization has this positive mission doesn't necessarily mean people who work for that organization aren't super cutthroat. And then I'd say tech is also a place where we suffer a lot from team conflict and conflict with bosses. I think in tech, there's a huge priority to emphasize skill, coding skills and things like that, and less these kind of interpersonal skills of like learning how to actually deal with conflict and things like that. And so the pendulum is swinging a little bit more to actually also sample those skills during the interview process and to promote based on those skills. But almost all of the one-on-one coaching I've done has been with people in tech. And most of the leadership training I do is actually with people in tech who are like, I've been a master coder for years, and now I'm in charge of a team of 15, and they all hate each other, and I have no idea how to handle these, people who are talking for status because I'm really good at this one thing and no one bothered to train me on this other thing. So some industries have just over prioritized skill building over interpersonal conflict training and things like that. But Eastern cultures that have these hierarchies, the West suffers a lot of other stuff. So that's a lot of that's around DEI and inclusion and things like that. And all these same problems too. But I've just it's been really interesting to see kind of the different cultural issues that have come up. Poland too. Poland has all these weird issues with power and status. So I've done some work. There's a Polish version of this book out. So I think that's also kind of something that's cropped up. It's interesting.
So where the power distance is quite high, you tend to see more of these, and individualistic cultures have a different set of issues.
Yeah, that's a lot of credit stealing, kiss up, kick down, those kinds of things. people love this Elon Musk kind of nano manager vibe, and not anymore, but there was definitely the more micro you were into management, that was a sign of dedication and hard work. We all kind of know now micromanagers they're the most common type of manager, but the least popular one. But we've been influenced by some high profile leaders in America that have made us think certain things are good ideas that we're realizing are absolutely terrible ideas when it comes to sort of who you want to mimic your own leadership based on.
Well,
But
I think their PR firms have done a great job, but done
a
damage to
lot of
organization cultures. Great. So, last question. Last question from my side. Um, moving away from the organization setting, if you come across jerks in a family setting at home, very difficult to deal with that. Do you have any tips to offer there?
Yeah, all the advice I give is for all social interactions. In fact, we were talking offline. I started off as a relationships researcher studying marriages and couples who fight, and most of the advice I give is actually based on that work. It's based on the four horsemen of relationship conflict and stonewalling and all these kinds of things. What predicts divorce, and I've actually brought that to the workplace. And so I think if you learn these strategies of conflict management, of how do you bring up a difficult issue, I recommend people read the micromanager chapter of how you actually talk to a boss or someone directly who has some behaviors you don't love. Those strategies are entirely based on marriage conflict literature strategies. You can use those at home as well. And I think, we tend to, one thing you should just keep in mind is we tend to get in patterns with people. Our fights follow a rhythm. They're like a dance that we're having. You say this insulting thing, I kitchen sink you by telling you 15 things I hate. We have a back and forth, we have a rhythm that is very hard to break. And so we get into these loops with people that are hard to break. And that's true at home and that's true in the workplace. So the strategies I recommend throughout this book are about breaking that kind of dance that you get into with people and developing something else entirely. But it takes a lot of work and you might fumble in the beginning, but definitely all these strategies, you don't like your micromanagement boss and you don't like your husband who leaves his socks everywhere. It's the same problem, right? You deal with it the same kinds of ways. And definitely these are flexible strategies that you can use to kind of break that bad dance that you get into with people, this rhythm that you well developed and memorized.
Yeah, sort of getting into slightly into transaction analysis, the sort of loop that you get into, the pattern sort of tends to repeat themselves. I think breaking that loop, I think is a great strategy. Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. I think you've been great. You shared a lot of tons of insights, and this video stream is going to be available on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and few other platforms. I think a lot more people beyond the live audience. Yeah, Prithvish says insightful discussion. Thank you so much, Prithvish, for being there, and thank you for so many others who've been there throughout the conversation. Um, Great, thanks, Ashima. So yeah, this is beyond the live audience. There are a lot of audience that will be there who will be watching the recorded version. Shout out to everyone. Please go to the website. I think the book is available at many platforms, so you don't really have to. It's not a treasure hunt to find out where you buy. I think it's available on most platforms. Do read, share with us. I think we have the social handles of Tessa as well. I think you can connect with her on the website as well and on LinkedIn. Her LinkedIn handle is tagged in this show, so you can reach out to her. And thank you so much. Thank you so much once again, Tessa.
Thank you for
Uh,
having me. This is super fun.
yeah, great. So see you all. Have a great evening, good night, and good morning to some of you. See you there.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.